What's your definition of marriage? Stay tuned, we're going to talk about it next. Hi, I'm Sue Jeffers for Libertarian Viewpoint. Libertarianism is all about liberty, the exercise of freedom that doesn't impinge on the rights of others. We constantly hear the drum roll of government solutions. This show's purpose is to allow you to see for yourself why non-government solutions are a better alternative. Today our guest is Dale Carpenter. Welcome, Dale. So what got you involved in advocating for non-government solutions?
Nice to meet you. I've been an advocate of individual liberty and limited government since I can remember. I think this is part of our history and tradition as a country, and it is part of our constitutional heritage. So in advocating these principles, we are living up to the best of our history and to the best of our fundamental law.
So when we go to the ballot box in November, we're going to have a constitutional question on our ballot. It's going to ask us to define the definition of marriage as being between one man and one woman. And it's kind of interesting how this ballot question got to the ballot. We've had over 120 amendments added to the Constitution, the Minnesota Constitution. And in the state of Minnesota, we have a Defense of Marriage Act. But apparently the Defense of Marriage Act wasn't good enough. So when the Republicans took over control of the House and the Senate over in St. Paul, knowing that they had a Democrat governor, that they would never get this kind of legislation passed, they chose the very unique way of bringing it to the people of Minnesota, and they passed at the very end of the legislative session. It was very contentious. They passed it through the House, through the Senate. Constitutional ballot questions do not go to the governor for a veto. They go straight to the ballot. So they just bypassed the governor. And you're here today to talk about that constitutional amendment.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And you are part of Minnesota United for All Families. And Minnesota United for All Families, you're a board member, but you're not speaking for them today. You're speaking as an individual, but you are a board member there.
That's right.
And you're going to work hard to make sure people vote no.
That's right. We think now that we have this vote on the November ballot, we have to make a decision as citizens whether we're going to actually pass this or not, whether we're going to vote yes or no. And I'm part of a group, and I personally believe that Minnesotans should vote no.
Okay, this group that you're a part of, it's a lot of people. It's Democrats, tell us a little bit about who this group is.
Minnesotans United for All Families is a broad coalition of people from all walks of life, all political affiliations and ideologies, religious and non-religious, who oppose this amendment for their own reasons and for some reasons that I think all of us have in common. It includes Republicans and Democrats and independents and libertarians and Green Party members and people who don't have a partisan affiliation, conservatives and liberals and libertarians, as I said, religious groups, labor unions, people who have different views on every other question agree on this question, which is that we should not have this amendment.
This is going to be a tough battle for you guys. Think about it. It's passed in, 31, 32, 33 states? And now it's Minnesota's turn. What makes you think you can convince people to vote no?
I think you're right, it is a tough battle. It's going to require a lot of work. It's going to unfortunately require a lot of money, and it's going to take up a lot to
How much money?
Well, one never knows exactly how much, but
I think back to some of the other states. I mean, it was millions and millions of dollars.
California, they spent $40 million on each side. Now, California is a much larger state than Minnesota. The media markets are much larger and they're much more expensive. So I don't think we're going to reach that level, but we are probably looking at a several $1 million campaign on each side. And so it's going to be expensive.
Is
and
this money that comes from outside of Minnesota as well, trying to influence this?
Money on ballot initiatives on amendment campaigns in Minnesota can come from any source. There's no limit on, it can't be from a foreign source, but inside the United States, it can come from any state. It can come from a corporation, from an individual, from an association, and there's no limit on the amount of the contribution. It simply has to be reported to the state that the contribution was made. And so this will be an expensive campaign, there's no doubt about it. But I think you asked what is different about Minnesota. I think there are a couple of things that are different about Minnesota. One of them is that we've had a sea change in opinions about the issue of same-sex marriage and whether we need to have these constitutional amendments just over the past few years. And especially among young people. If you look at the polls now, we're seeing polls of young people between, say, 18 and 34 are now saying by about 70% that they oppose constitutional amendments and actually support marriages for same-sex couples. So that's a big change. And attitudes even among older voters have changed. Attitudes among Republicans have shifted more in favor of allowing people to get married. That's a big difference. The second big difference is, I think, we are learning from the experience of other states who have now recognized same-sex marriage, that when you let people get married, especially when they're raising their own kids, it doesn't hurt anyone. And in fact, it only helps the people who can get married. It helps the stability of their families. We've got evidence about this now, so we don't need to just guess about it.
How many states have said gay marriage is okay?
We now have same-sex marriage in 6 states and in the District of Columbia. And we have full recognition of civil unions that allow same-sex couples the status and the privilege, but without the title marriage in many other states. So we've got a considerable portion of the country now living in states where this is allowed, and there have been no harmful effects. So that has changed.
There are a lot of cities in Minnesota now who are starting domestic registry things in their. I'm trying to remember if it was Eden Prairie that was the last one that did it. So get this, for $25 you can register that you're a couple, and then if you break up, you got to pay another $25 to unregister. I think it's a revenue raiser and a political statement, and that makes me mad, you know, that Eden Prairie or whatever district it was that they did that. But you think the definition of marriage, you really think it's going to pass this time? I
think we're going to win, and I said, because I think attitudes have shifted and I think people are realizing there's no harm. There's another difference, and that is that in Minnesota there's a slightly higher barrier to passing an amendment. You have to actually get a majority of all the votes cast in the election, not just the ones where people make it to the end of the ballot. And so for people who are unsure about how to vote, they may decide, you know, I don't want to vote on this issue. I don't think it's something I should even be voting on. And if they make that decision, then they will count against the majority for the amendment. And if that had been the case,
leave it blank,
they leave it blank.
It's a no vote.
It counts against the majority. It counts as a no, effectively, if people just don't want to vote on it or what have you. If that had been the case in California with Prop 8, which is the ban on same-sex marriage in that state, then Prop 8 would have been defeated. So
I get really confused on the Prop 8 and what Arizona did and what Maine does and what whoever does. I have enough trouble keeping track of what goes on in the state of Minnesota.
But you're absolutely right. It's passed in every other state where it's been up for a vote. But I really do believe that we have a shift in attitudes and one that is moving in our favor.
Enough of a shift to pass it. See, I don't think it's going to pass.
I think the amendment will pass.
No, I think the amendment
will be defeated.
No, I think people are going to go in and vote yes, marriage should be between a man and a woman. I don't think we've changed all that much. So now, convince me.
Well,
convince me why. I don't trust the polls. I don't believe the polls. You know, polls are a snapshot of time. It depends on how they ask the question, who they ask the question to. So yes, I mean, I agree that there's some value in the polls, but now I want you to convince me why I should vote no.
Well, so why should you vote no? That's a different question from whether the people are going to vote no. So why should you vote no?
Do you want to have the battle why I think it's going to go well? No, I want you to be able to say,
absolutely.
Tell us why this will pass.
So why, the reason I think people...
He's a lawyer. lawyer. Can you tell he's a lawyer?
The reason I think people should vote no, and I think ultimately many will vote no, and most will vote no, is that first of all, from the perspective of someone who values individual liberty and believes truly in limited government, you have to ask yourself, how on earth does this amendment advance the principle of individual liberty and limited government?
And I'm going to tell you right there, that is the best argument ever
That's right.
out there. So stay focused on that one. But okay, keep going.
It does nothing to advance these historical commitments that we have made, which is that we allow people to make very fundamental choices in their own lives, even when we don't personally believe in those choices or believe that those are the best choices. We let people make their own choices, and I think that argues in favor of letting people get married when they want to and not limiting their choices by government power, and especially not using our Constitution for that purpose. Our Constitution is a charter of individual liberties and freedoms and protection from the interference of the government. It is not an instrument for the government to intrude on our personal choices. So that's ultimately the reason that people who believe, like us, in individual liberty and limited government should vote against it.
I've talked to a lot of people who adamantly believe marriage is between a man and a woman, but for that very reason, that they're messing with the Constitution, they will not vote for it.
That's right. And I think a lot of people, it's not, you have your own religious beliefs. I think that's terrific. We defend the right of every person to have their own religious beliefs, their own moral values, the way that they want to run their own lives and teach within their own families and their own churches and their own associations. That's something consistent with individual liberty. But mandating that someone else live by our moral code, that is not part of our historic commitment to individual liberty and limited government.
Government comes in and intrudes in our life all the time. It tries to tell us what food we can eat, what water we can drink, what cars we can drive, they do it all the time. What's the difference?
Well, I'll tell you, we allow some regulations and some intrusions when, in a way that prohibits people from harming others, and there's nothing in allowing two people of the same sex to get married that harms anyone else. Nobody's marriage is made weaker because your neighbors down the block are allowed to get married for the first time. And if you really value the social stability that marriage helps to provide, can't guarantee, but it helps to provide, then you should be in favor of letting more people get married and not restricting marriage as those who are advocating this amendment want to do.
Catholics are going to disagree with you. Orthodox Jews are going to disagree with you. Muslims are going to disagree with you because their religion so clearly states that marriage is defined as between a man and a woman.
And I think there are people who have very strong religious beliefs, but most people, I think, in our society, even with strong religious beliefs about an issue, recognize that there is a distinction between religious authority and civil authority. And that line is sometimes hard to walk, but we have to be careful about it, because another one of our historic constitutional commitments is to the idea we have to be a plural republic in which lots of people with radically different views about the good life can live together side by side. We let them make those choices even when we think they're wrong, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. And there's just no reason to believe that allowing two people to get married will actually hurt anyone, and instead it helps people. So why would we ban it?
Some people, especially the very religious ones, they just come in and they say, leave marriage alone. We'll give you a civil union, but you are not touching marriage. It's a sacrament. It's a religious expression. What do you say to that?
And what I would say to that is, in your own church, you can have the sacrament of marriage and define it in any way you want, and I will defend your liberty to do that, as will everyone else that I know on this issue. But our civil law is not sacramental law. It is not protecting sacraments. It may protect the freedom of people to engage in them, but it does not codify a particular religious tradition. We need to try to avoid doing that.
But kind of. I mean, you have to go to the government to get your marriage license.
You do.
I mean, the lines are very blurred.
There are, but I think as you know, the government has a system of registering your relationship through marriage because the government makes a lot of rights and protections and responsibilities applicable to that relationship. So people go in to get the registration so that we're very clear at the outset. You do have the following responsibilities and rights. You share debts, for example. You can make decisions for each other in the absence of a power of attorney, and inherit without a will, and so forth. We want to make sure that people know what they're getting into, and so that's why we have this system. As long as we're going to have that system, then it doesn't make sense to draw arbitrary lines, cutting some people out, unless we have some reason to believe that including them and allowing them to marry will cause some terrible harm. No evidence for that anywhere in any of the country or in any of the dozen countries around the world that are now permitting it. And I think religious people do recognize that there is a division of civil and religious authority, and that not every religious belief must be translated into law. I have that faith in my fellow citizens. Orthodox Jews, conservative Catholics, Muslims, and so forth, I think they can see that distinction. And wherever we have erased that distinction, it has led to no end of trouble around the world.
Some religions are very troubled because they believe that once gays are allowed to marry each other, that then churches will be forced to marry gay people.
That is sometimes expressed. I think anyone who knows the constitutional law of the United States knows that that is not a realistic fear. I think anyone who's looked at what has happened in countries and in states, looking at the evidence, will know that no church has been required to recognize same-sex marriages that they do not want to recognize. So that, I think, is a red herring. That is an argument put out to instill fear in people that is really not legitimate, does not have a very good grounding.
But that fear is resonating.
There is a fear out there, and I think one of the things we'll have to do is say, we believe in individual liberty and freedom, and that means individual liberty for people we agree with and individual liberty for people we disagree with. And so we can get married, but you can practice your religious faith. There is no inconsistency between these two ideas. These are fully consistent ideas. It's not as if, some public policy decisions are difficult because they involve a trade-off. It's going to create some good, but it's also going to cause some harm. There will be some winners and there will be some losers. Same-sex marriage in the civil law is a win-win proposition. We can do both, protect liberty for everybody, those who agree and those who disagree.
And here's the other question that I hear a lot is, well, why do gay people need to get married when all they have to do is go to a lawyer and draw up a power of attorney for whatever?
Well, the answer to that, there's a couple of answers to that. One of them is that I would urge anyone who thinks that a lawyer is an easy answer to all of the problems that life may bring to you legally should try it sometime and find out how expensive it will be to get a moment of that lawyer's time, how expensive it will be to draft up all of the documents that you will need to draft up. And at the end of the day, when you've done thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars worth of lawyers' fees, at the end of the day, you still won't have all of the protections that people who are married have, because lawyers can't, those are private agreements. They have no special status in the law, and so lawyers can't, for example, make a person's inheritance through Social Security or disability available to a person who's married. Lawyers can't exempt you from having to testify at a trial against your life partner. There are lots of things, 515 examples in Minnesota law alone of things that lawyers just aren't going to be able to do for you.
Really? Like what?
Well, the ones I just mentioned. I'll give you a good example of this. If you live with a same-sex partner and you can't get married, and one of you dies and transfers their half of the ownership in the home to you, that is considered a gift for purposes of taxation. So let's say your home is worth $300,000 and each of you has $150,000 stake. That partner dies, you have $150,000 in income for tax purposes that you're going to have to pay on your next tax bill. If you're married, you get an exemption in the law. That does not count as a gift for you. You can own the house together and you've not been given the gift of your house. So people can actually be forced out of their homes because they cannot afford to pay taxes, and those taxes are imposed on them because they can't get married. You have a child.
The same thing happens to children too. You know, your parents die, and there's so many taxes that.
That's
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And think what happens when, for example, two people of the same sex who can't get married are raising a child together. Maybe only one of them is the legal parent of that child, but both of them put their time and effort and energy into raising the child and are the only parents that child has ever known. If their relationship ends and there's no marriage between the two, a court could declare that the parent who is not the formal legal parent has no rights in the child and has no responsibilities to help child support. That's a horrible thing to happen to a child who's only known those two parents. And we have thousands of those kids being raised in the state. What do we say to them? Why do we prohibit their parents from having a legal relationship that will enable their families to have some protection in the law? For what? So that somebody can say this is a sacrament? That can't be the answer.
I know I hear a lot too that I think gay people should be able to get married to each other because they should be just as unhappy as I am. And they talk, personally I'm not married, but and which I just laugh and yeah, there's some truth in that.
Well, there's something too, because as soon as you get gay marriage, you will have divorces, and
Right.
everybody gets to experience the joys of divorce law. There's a kind of a wry humor about that. I think what I'd say is, making choices in life does mean you take on responsibilities. And if you take on the responsibility of marriage, you have to recognize you are committing to something in the law, and there are consequences to it. And I think those are consequences that some people will not want to take on, so they should have the choice not to marry. Nobody should be forced to marry. But if they want to take them on, we should let them.
Okay, so we have it on the ballot in November. There's going to be millions and millions and millions of dollars in advertising on both sides. You're going to have to go out all across the state of Minnesota and convince basically a supermajority to approve this. How are you going to do that?
Well, the elements of a campaign are many. There is an element of the campaign that will involve getting out the right message, that this is not a threat to liberty, this is an enhancement of liberty, this is stabilizing and so forth. There's an element to the campaign that will involve raising money to do everything else you need to do. There's an element of the campaign that will be organizing volunteers and going into the field and talking to people, having
You're not going to knock
conversations.
at my door, are you?
I can't promise you that we're not, but I'll tell you what, if you tell them that you talked to me and you're already on board, they'll leave. They'll leave.
I fight with the Sierra Club at least once a week on my doorstep.
So I hope they do knock at your door, and because I want to get everybody covered in Minnesota. I don't think we should take any vote for granted, because I do not believe that the people who traditionally oppose gay marriage should necessarily support this amendment. It's already the law in Minnesota that you can't get married. It's already the law that we don't recognize your marriage from out of state. How many times do we need to lock that door or shut that door in people's faces?
Well, a lot of people say, hey, the courts will change it.
Well, there's always the possibility of, that you might fear a court doing something. What I would say about that is a couple of things. I don't think we should be wary of changing the Constitution in anticipation of possible future court decisions. When we actually have a court decision, or when we're close to one, we could revisit the issue. We're nowhere close to that in Minnesota. We don't have any decision in Minnesota in favor of gay marriage. The Minnesota Supreme Court spoke to this issue 40 years ago and rejected the claim. I think most people who are familiar with the courts in Minnesota do not believe that ultimately we're going to have a court-mandated marriage. So I think the fear is exaggerated, but let's suppose you thought there was a fear. If you thought that was the reason to pass this amendment, then you would pass an amendment that said it's up to the legislature to define marriage. It's not anybody else's. The courts can't get involved. That's not what this amendment is. This amendment prohibits the people from speaking through their legislative representatives to change the understanding and allow same-sex couples to wed. So this amendment is a much broader effort than that. It's shutting off future generations from looking at this issue afresh, weighing the evidence, and deciding for themselves. Instead, they're going to have to go back through a constitutional amendment process. That's not right for us to shut off their options on this issue. So I think the fears are exaggerated, and to the extent that the fears of courts have any justification, this amendment is not the answer to that perceived problem.
I just predict that this is going to get so ugly. So the rhetoric and I just think it's going to just get so ugly.
It's a possibility, and I want to avoid it. And I think it is the responsibility of advocates on both sides to say it should be possible to have a civil, rational, reasonable discussion of this issue. And I think there have been violations of that principle on both sides in the past in other places. And I think we can conduct a better debate than that in Minnesota. And I have some faith that we will. It's not to say there won't be individuals on either side, but I think as long as we respect each other and we conduct a civil discussion and emphasize the importance of doing so, we can make this a better discussion. And I'll say something else about it. If we have a civil, rational discussion about this issue in which we should just talk about the facts and talk about the evidence and consider the arguments, I think those who oppose the amendment win. I don't think we win shouting matches, but I think we win a deliberate, thoughtful discussion on this issue.
Okay, now I want you to look in the camera and speak to the voters. Tell them how they should cast their ballot and why.
Well, I urge Minnesotans to vote no on this amendment in the November election, and I do so for a couple of reasons. One is that this amendment does nothing to advance the cause of individual liberty and limited government. The other is that it deprives families in Minnesota of protection in the law that they need. And the third is that marriage is a good thing, and so we ought to encourage people actually to get married to enhance stability in our society. And then finally, we can do all of this. We can vote no on this amendment without in any way harming any person's religious liberty. We must protect religious liberty, and we have done so and will do so in this state, even when this amendment is defeated. So I hope that Minnesotans will vote no.
That was great. Thank you so
Thanks.
much for the
You
interview
bet.
today. I really
You bet.
enjoyed it.
You bet.
Well, we're out of time. If you find yourself agreeing with our guest, you might be a libertarian. To find out, take the world's smallest quiz at www.theadvocates.org. Remember, Libertarian Viewpoint brings you the non-government, liberty-based solutions that other media refuse to tell you about. Liberty works, and it's always the best choice. If anyone in government can prove otherwise, I challenge them to speak up. To view past shows, search YouTube using Libertarian Viewpoint. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for other shows of Libertarian Viewpoint.